guys, welcome back to Primer Podcast. We are back this week with Pete talking about difficult people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's been a great series to dig down and find out that I can be difficult.
Yeah.
So, that's
Yeah. And I hope, I hope a big emphasis of this series is to say, is not to diminish that we have challenging relationships and challenging circumstances that we find ourselves in, but instead to maybe to empower us a little bit, to have some ownership over our ability to process through those things, even when those in our life seemingly are unwilling to do so. And I think this week, more than any week, is going to put that ball in our court in kind of an uncomfortable way. And I'll say what we've been saying throughout the series, that when we're talking about difficult people, when we're talking about reconciliation and restoration and these types of forgiveness, we're talking within the confines of the normal everyday struggles that you have in your relationships.
right.
We're not talking about abuse and mental harm and manipulation and these kind of things. And we encourage you to reach out to get support and help you need if you find yourself in that. But if you're just processing through, how do I wrestle with these normal everyday relationships that I seem to butt my heads with my colleagues and my friends and my children and my spouse and my in-laws and whatever it is. Hopefully this gives us some tools that says, okay, here are some things that you can do that maybe feel a little uncomfortable, maybe feel a little unfair, but perhaps are going to open up opportunities to be in redemptive relationships that bring you a whole lot more joy than ones that are constantly seeking to be even and fair. So we're going to see here, we're going to read in Genesis 27. But for a quick recap, Jacob and his mom Rebecca have just effectively deceived Isaac in his old age into giving the blessing, the inheritance that was intended for Esau to Isaac. Esau has now come back and he has become the victim of this deceit. And Isaac does not have a blessing to offer him. And it just weighs so heavy on him that he has really, been the short end of the stick, and his brother has acted unfairly and has cheated him out of this thing. Unlike when we talked about with the birthright, where Esau was negligent with the birthright, this is a true deception, where his brother has acted in a way that is unfair, is unjust, and has left Esau as a victim to his actions. And so we're going to jump into 27, verse 41, because we're going to see what is Esau's reaction to this injustice.
So it says, Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. He said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are near. Then I will kill my brother Jacob."
Yeah. So how does he react?
He has a lot of hurt and judgment, and it says grudge. I mean, it's definitely a very grudgingly,
right.
Yeah, and I can understand like him being upset. Like that is something that like you said, is something that like Jacob did and his own mother did against him. So it's a trick of Isaac, but they did something to Esau that I wouldn't say that I would feel any different than Esau for some time.
Yeah, I mean there's definitely some deep wounding that happens here. And this grudge that Esau is holding is, I think, from a human perspective, justifiable. Right? I don't think, I'm going to murder my brother is justifiable, but this anger and this feeling there where, and we don't know exactly if this is hyperbole from Esau or what's going on here, but there's this intense demonstration that he has been treated unfairly, that he's angry. And what's going to happen because of this justified reaction is it's going to completely destroy their family.
Mm-hmm.
And so immediately after this, Rebecca, the mother, catches wind again of what Esau has said, this kind of I'm going to kill my brother kind of space. And she sends Jacob off to her family member, Laban, and he's going to be there for over a decade of time. Their family is split apart. Their parents are now mourning this loss. There's certainly a fracture between Esau and Rebekah.
Mm-hmm.
There's a fracture between Isaac and Esau. There's this clear splitting of these two brothers, and it just throws this family into turmoil. And I think that's probably something that we can relate with in our context is when decisions have been made in our family that for a season, for a period, sends us into turmoil.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easy in this moment to say, look at what Jacob has done, right? This is the product of Jacob's deceit, the product of Rebekah and Jacob's
Mm-hmm.
deceit. This should have been expected. What other outcome did you intend to have happen here? Right?
Yeah.
That this deceit has happened. That this very important blessing, this power dynamic has shifted, and it has broken up this family that's intended to be a blessing to all nations. And I think that is justifiably and understandably where we go to first. What I want to look at this week, and this is the harder part, because it forces us to carry a different perspective, is to say at the same time, Esau still had within his power the ability to avoid the worst outcome.
Mm-hmm.
It was still within Esau's power to be able to offer forgiveness to his brother. And I think that is remarkably difficult to accept, right? This idea that his anger is justifiable, and yet he still has the capacity to seek a better outcome in spite of the fact that he has been wounded, that he has been hurt, that this wound goes deep in his life. And I think it's because we think about reconciliation and relationship as dependent upon a sincere apology,
Mm-hmm.
dependent upon sincere confession. But what I want to think about this week is that when we do that, then we carry all of this emotional baggage and anger that we are completely helpless to do anything about unless someone else in our life is willing to take the first step.
Yeah, it's contingent on that.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's contingent upon that apology. And oftentimes that apology doesn't come. And I like what Tim Keller talks about this concept in his book, aptly titled Forgive. But he talks about these two types of forgiveness and these inward and these outward forgiveness. And so he says this, these are not two kinds of forgiveness, but two aspects or stages of it. One could say that the first must always happen and the second may happen, but is not always possible. Attitudinal forgiveness or inward forgiveness can occur without reconciliation, but reconciliation cannot happen unless attitudinal forgiveness has already occurred. Mm-hmm. And so again, that's a complicated statement, but it basically points to the reality that actually the first domino that needs to fall in reconciliation is the domino of forgiveness. That's going to come before confession,
mm-hmm.
before an apology, is my ability to forgive someone else in spite of how unjustly I've been treated, in spite of how hurt I am, is going to lay the table for redeemed and reconciled relationships. And I think that's super hard. If Ephesians 4 talks about it a little bit, I know you've got that. Mm-hmm. So if you open up to Ephesians 4, I think 25 through 27 would be great.
Yeah. So therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor. For we are all members of one body. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry.
Yeah. So how often have you heard that statement, do not let the sun go down while you're still angry? And how have you interpreted that?
Pretty much don't go to bed angry is I think that's literally one of the Nick talked about this. So, somebody coming up and asking, how have you been able to be married for 22 years?
Yeah.
And that, one word answer type of thing. But I remember being married, and gosh, I bet you I had so many people say, "Don't ever go to bed angry."
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's where this came from, but how hard that is.
Yeah.
Unless you're I read something that had said, forgiveness is more about your faith in God and your faith in that person, less about your feeling.
Yeah.
And like how like it
Mm.
if you're contingent of if your love for that person's contingent on how they treat you, and not necessarily in just that in it's just that one action.
Yeah.
It's not how they treat you. If you're
Yeah.
treated poorly, it's different. But in a one circumstance, if Joey hurt my feelings, if I take my love away from him for that period of time, that's and not allowing that forgiveness.
Yeah.
It's more about understanding my faith in
Yeah.
God and my faith in my marriage.
Yeah.
And I think about Matthew and in Luke, Jesus was asked how many times do you forgive, and in
Yeah.
Matthew it says not 7 times but 77 times.
Yeah. 7 times 7
Yeah,
times.
so yeah,
7 times 70 times.
and then in Luke it says 7 times in a day.
Yeah.
And so and I think how hard that is. That is not a feeling that I would want to do.
Right.
That is faith.
Yeah.
That it'd have to come from faith.
Yeah, and I think there's something interesting here too, because anytime I've wrestled with this was like a mantra for my family growing up, was like, don't go to sleep on your anger. And the way we practiced that, practically speaking, was like if I had a qualm with my brother, we had to resolve our conflict that day. Like we weren't going to sleep until we had figured it out. And that can sometimes work between brothers, but it gets more complicated when maybe the person that has perpetrated the hurt is not somebody that lives with you,
Right.
is not somebody that you share a home with. And it can also be really difficult because sometimes both people aren't going to come to the same conclusion and be prepared to enter in that space the same way. The only way this is possible is if we understand forgiveness as something that I do inwardly that prepares the foundation for the overarching outward forgiveness that we see in reconciliation. It's this space where it says, even though that other person hasn't recognized the hurt that they have, put upon me, I am willing to forgive them, and I have forgiven them in my heart. And then when they are prepared to accept that, now we can have reconciliation in our relationship with one another. I think about early on in Brittany and I's marriage, we would have arguments about, silly things, and, about whether or not the butter was supposed to be in the refrigerator on the table, probably more significant things than that. But we would have this mantra where it was like, we can't go to bed unless we have both said our sorries and accepted forgiveness, right? And there's sometimes that just doesn't work that way.
Right.
But there's a different space of being able to say, man, I so love this person that I've forgiven them. I've assumed the best in them. And it also requires me to care deeper about what God sees than what somebody else sees. And I think you alluded to that a little bit, is that if I need you to know my hurt,
Yeah.
and know that you hurt me or offended me or agitated me, then I can't go to sleep without you knowing that and apologizing for that and forgiving you that. Instead, if I can recognize and feel comfort in recognizing that my God has seen that hurt, and my God is big enough to fill that void in my life, now I can forgive unconditionally. When Jesus talks about that forgiveness, that's the 7 times the 70, he immediately tells a parable about somebody that is forgiven this exorbitant amount of debt. And then because of that goes out and should be able to forgive freely, but still holds this grudge against somebody that has a minimal debt against them.
Yeah.
Right. But I think that's that picture, is that if I'm outwardly focused on the other person that has harmed me or wronged me, it's always going to become a barrier to me being able to accept that forgiveness, to release that anger in me. But if I have instead reflected on the depth of the forgiveness that God has given me, that gives me capacity to forgive, even when it's one-sided, and even when it doesn't necessarily have an equitable response on the other side. I don't know about you, but I just feel like I'm always in these situations where there are times that I need to like remind myself that I'm agitated at like one of my kids or one of my friends or those kind of things. It's like things are good, and then I'm like, oh wait a minute, you never said sorry for this kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like that happens all the time, and it's because we've bought into this myth that like I have to have received the apology for me to be able to offer the forgiveness.
Yeah. I know for me, especially in my relationship with Joey, I'm the horrible one of not being able to say I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And so so he has taught me a lot of forgiveness even when he doesn't get a sorry or
Yeah.
apology. And so I know like where you're saying that you kind of hold on to it, and I do in almost the opposite way.
Yeah.
And so just realizing it, and a lot of times, like if I have been hurt, and I know we end up, our closest relationships are our spouses, and if I, a lot of times, if Joey has hurt or done a wrong, um, one of my biggest ways of reminding myself to how easily it is to forgive him is to remind myself how easily God has forgiven us.
Yeah.
And that always makes me think, if God can do this for us,
Yeah.
how can we not for our
Yeah.
loved ones and for our friends and our family? And so I always think of that. Usually it takes me a little while, but
Yeah, and I also like in that the passage in Ephesians where it starts, it says speak the truth, and I think there's a vulnerability in that too, where it's like so often I'm expecting you to just know that you hurt me, and to know and I'm waiting until you have identified that, recognized that, apologized for that. Now we can move on.
Yeah.
There's this vulnerability, and it's like, be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Not, and it says in love, right? Not angrily, not saying how dare you hurt me, but like, hey, I'm vulnerable. I want you to know that this is a hurt that I've experienced, and I don't think, because I assume the best because I tell a creative story, I don't think it's your fault or your intention, I should say, but that's how I'm feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And then that now sets the ground level to then offer that forgiveness. So I've spoken vulnerably that I've hurt. I don't need you to apologize for that in this moment. I'm not trying to force you to apologize, but I do feel like a part of my process of forgiveness is being honest with that. And then that allows me the space to forgive, which I think is cool.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So hopefully you guys are able to talk in your groups and your individual study and dig down into what it means to forgive. We'll see you next week. Bye.